Carson Prescott's thumb crushed into the notch above Lena Ortiz's collarbone, while his fingers cinched her throat, and her airway folded down to a narrow, burning slit that let in almost no air. Her back hit cinder block hard enough to rattle the framed intake protocols beside her head. The foreclosure packet in Carson's other hand snapped open and smacked her cheek, pages slapping skin and concrete in quick, humiliating beats. She tried to draw breath and got a scrape of air that tasted like bleach, rust, and panic. The corridor lights were set to overnight dim, sodium yellow and sick, turning faces flat and making shadows look deeper than they were. She heard kennels vibrating before she understood why. Atlas took the kick in the ribs with a sound like a hammer striking a steel post. It echoed down the intake corridor and back again, ricocheting off chain-link gates, drain grates, and painted block walls. Atlas's body jolted sideways on the slick concrete, claws scraping for traction, shoulders slamming a lower kennel door. The old shepherd did not yelp. He went rigid. His tan and black saddleback coat flashed gold where the overhead light caught it, and dark as iron where his body crossed shadow. And then his chest started that low, rolling sound Lena felt more than heard. "Sign it," Carson said, breath warm with coffee and mint over her face. "You had your warning." Lena grabbed his wrist with both hands, trying to peel his grip off in millimeters. She had field-dressed arterial bleeds under rotor wash and held pressure on shattered limbs in alley triage when rounds were still cracking, 2 blocks over. But oxygen debt made every skill narrow down to one truth. Air first. Nothing else. Her vision tunneled. She saw details she did not want to see. The polished edge of Carson's boot, rain flecks still drying on imported leather, the crisp fold of his camel coat, the small Prescott family crest stamped in gold on his cufflink as it pressed against her jaw. The floor smelled of disinfectant and wet wool. Somebody had mopped 20 minutes ago. The bucket was still there. 14 people stood in that corridor and behind the observation glass, and not one of them moved. 2 junior clerks in county ID lanyards froze near the intake desk with clipboards hugged to their chests. 6 kennel volunteers lined the wall by the supply lockers, shoulders rounded, eyes darting between Carson's hand on Lena's throat, and Atlas trying to brace his weight off his bad hip. 3 county deputies in civil standby vests stood broad and armed beside the fire door. 3 city code officers in navy windbreakers watched from behind glass, one with a tablet lifted, one with folded arms, one with lips pressed flat like he was waiting for a meeting to start. One deputy scrolled his phone with his thumb, face lit blue, expression bored, as if he were checking the weather before a fishing trip. A volunteer in a gray sweatshirt stared down into the yellow mop bucket, fixed on the thin circles of dirty water spinning around a string mop head, as if tracking that little whirlpool was easier than looking at Carson's hand. A second volunteer took a half-step forward, saw Carson glance her way, and retreated until her spine touched the lockers. The younger clerk whispered, "Oh, God." So softly, Lena only caught it because everything else had gone sharp and distant. Nobody helped. Carson shoved the top sheet of the packet into Lena's face again, close enough for her to see the county seal and black signatures. "Facility transfer authorization," he said. "Emergency condemnation for unsafe operation. Signed, filed, enforceable. We clear by sunrise. You can cooperate or you can be removed." She managed one rasp word. "Fraud." His smile did not change. "Big accusation for someone who can't pay power bills." He tightened his grip. Stars burst along the edges of her vision. Her pulse hammered at her temples, then seemed to move into her throat, drumming directly under his fingers. Atlas shifted, favoring left rear, old Kandahar shrapnel pain, waking in cold concrete and stress. The growl in him got lower, slower, not loud, worse than loud. Lena had learned that register in the first month she worked this building. Atlas didn't waste warning when he thought danger was real. He gave one warning and then made a decision. "Control your dog," one deputy said to no one and everyone, voice flat, like reading from procedure. "Control your man," Lena tried to say, but it came out broken and thin. The deputy with the phone never looked up. Carson angled his head and spoke to the room while he kept pressure on her airway. "My father funds half your overtime. We're done pretending this place is viable. There's a purchase agreement, there's county action, and there's a redevelopment schedule. This isn't a debate." He glanced toward the observation room. "You all know what happens if this drags." One of the code officers nodded once without meeting Lena's eyes. From somewhere down the hall, behind two secured doors, a metal bowl clanged in a kennel run. Atlas flinched at the sound, right ear lagging a fraction, behind left. That old partial hearing loss from blast overpressure still written into his body. He planted again, chest low, gaze locked on Carson's torso and hands. Not the face. The hands. Dogs who had worked breach and rubble learned where decisions lived. Lena tried to hook a foot behind Carson's ankle and felt her own balance slip instead. He pinned her harder, forearm grinding into her clavicle, and the cinder block seam bit into her spine through scrubs and fleece. Her larynx felt bruised from inside. Her fingertips tingled. She forced herself not to look at Atlas's ribs where the boot had landed. If she looked, she might break rhythm. If she broke rhythm, she would black out. The younger clerk said, louder this time, "Deputy, please." No one answered her. A volunteer started filming, hands shaking so hard the phone lens jittered. Maybe she meant to post it later, maybe she just needed something to do with her hands. To Lena, the phone looked like a shield, witness safer than intervention. Lena filed it away with clinical cruelty, the way medics catalog wounds in triage when there isn't time for anger. Carson leaned in until his forehead nearly touched Lena's. "You should have signed last week," he said. "Now you sign in front of everyone." Atlas shifted one paw forward. 3 deputies' hands moved at once toward belts and holsters, not to restrain Carson, but to manage the dog. The corridor got smaller. Air, light, sound, all compressed to pressure points. Lena could hear her own pulse and Atlas's breathing, and the faint electric buzz from the security lock on the north door. She knew exactly what that lock sounded like when it released. She had heard it at shift change for 2 years. In that second, she needed it to open more than she had needed anything since Hellman. It clicked. Then Jack Brooks stepped through the security door in NWU Type 3 camouflage, rain still darkening the shoulders, scar tight along his jaw, broad-shouldered and silent, and Atlas's ears rotated forward before Jack said a word, the shift in the corridor hitting Lena like a hard break. Carson did not turn yet. He was still smiling at Lena, still carrying that proprietary confidence, still talking. "By sunrise, this whole block is ours." He didn't look behind him. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. If you believe veterans and their working dogs should not be erased by money, subscribe and stay to the end. What happened in that corridor did not just stop an assault. It broke a family dynasty's grip on an entire town. Then Atlas moved. He did not lunge. He did not bark. His ears rotated hard forward, his body locked, and a low sound rolled out of his chest, like distant thunder choosing one ridge and staying there. The short drag leash, still clipped to Atlas from intake, skated over the concrete. Jack's hand closed on it with 2 fingers and a thumb, loose but absolute. And the old shepherd settled half an inch without taking his eyes off Carson Prescott's hands. That was the first correction in the room. Lena felt it before she could name it. Carson still had her throat. Her airway was still a pinched tube burning from inside. Her pulse still punched against his fingers. But the corridor's balance shifted in a way she had only ever felt in triage tents, when the right surgeon stepped in and the noise fell away. Not calmer, narrower, more precise. She dragged a ragged sip of air and tasted rain now, wet canvas and cold night riding in from the open security door behind Jack. Carson kept talking because men like him mistook sound for control. "You don't get a vote," he said, still close to her face, still pressing paper against her cheek. "This property is condemned. These kennels are done. You can keep choking on your pride, Lena, or you can sign and walk out." He was speaking to her, but his eyes cut sideways toward the deputies. He wanted witnesses to his certainty. He wanted them nodding. 3 deputies looked at Jack instead. None of them saluted. None of them spoke. But their shoulders changed. The deputy with the phone lowered it to his thigh, screen still lit blue against his vest. The oldest deputy, the one with white at both temples, shifted one boot back as if he had remembered where exits were and who might need one first. The youngest deputy touched his body cam without activating it, thumb hovering, uncertain for the first time that night. The 6 volunteers by the lockers tracked the same line of sight and saw the same details all at once. NWU, Type 3, digital camouflage darkened by rain. Sleeves rolled to forearms marked by old, pale scars. Jawline cut by one thicker scar that tugged when he clenched his teeth. Boots set shoulder width, not aggressive, not yielding. A face built from quiet angles and sleepless years. Jack did not ask what happened. He already knew enough. Carson's hand on Lena's throat. Lena's heels skidding for traction on wet concrete. Atlas favoring left rear after that kick. Weight loaded anyway, ready anyway. Papers in Carson's fist, with the county seal flashed at the top. 14 witnesses trying to look useful and uninvolved at the same time. He took all of it in one sweep. Lena saw his eyes settle on the pressure point under Carson's thumb and felt something in her chest unclench even while she still couldn't breathe cleanly. Jack had spent years building threat maps in the first second after contact. Doorways, angles, leverage, hands, where fear was hiding, where panic would go. That training never left. Neither did the cost. Atlas took one silent step that brought him level with Jack's left knee. Not in front, not behind. Position learned under gunfire and reinforced by grief. The code officer with the tablet finally looked down at his own screen as if checking a checklist could rebuild authority. "Sir," he said, not to Jack, not to Carson, just into the corridor. "County order is valid as filed." His voice shook on the last word. Lena's vision pulsed at the edges. She needed oxygen and hated that her body made her count seconds like this. She kept her eyes open by force and watched Carson's confidence keep trying to occupy the full room, while the room quietly refused him. Carson shifted his grip, trying to keep his thumb dug in while turning his head over his shoulder. He looked Jack up and down once, dismissive by reflex. "You with private security?" he asked. "You're late." Jack didn't answer. Atlas's hackles lifted in a dark ridge along his spine, coat catching sodium light in broken gold. He held that low growl steady as a motor under load, and his right ear lagged when a kennel gate rattled down the hall. Old injury, old damage, still tracking threat with frightening accuracy. Carson smirked at the dog. "Control that animal," he said louder now, angling the command toward the deputies as if they were an extension of his hand. "If it comes at me, I sue this dump into dust." Nobody moved to grab Atlas. The younger clerk, The one who had whispered earlier swallowed hard and stepped behind the intake counter where the desk phone sat. She didn't pick it up, but she put her hand on it. Tiny motion, trembling fingers. In rooms like this, that counted. Lena tried to speak and coughed instead, a dry, tearing cough that scraped her throat raw. Carson pressed harder in response, more irritated than threatened, and leaned back into the posture of a man giving a presentation. "My father owns this town," he said. "Hospital board, zoning board, sheriff contracts. You think this place survives 1 week without our goodwill?" He expected the line to land like a verdict. It landed like a flare over his own position. Jack took 1 step forward, and the deputy with white at his temples moved to the wall to clear the lane without being told. A volunteer near the mop bucket flinched as if expecting impact. The fluorescent hum seemed louder in the silence that followed, and somewhere in Kennel Run C, a retired explosives dog started whining through chain link in short, anxious bursts. Lena tasted blood where she had bitten the inside of her cheek. She forced her focus to stay on Jack's hands. Steady, empty, ready to break a hold without breaking a neck. He had done that kind of math in alleys, in compounds, in doorways, where fractions of seconds decided who got carried out. His teammate Ryan Keene had died, waiting for a medevac window that never opened, and the failure had carved a permanent line through Jack's sleep. Insomnia lived in the hollows under his eyes. Hypervigilance lived in the way he cataloged every wrist, every pocket, every choke point without looking rushed. Carson missed all of it. Men born cushioned from consequence rarely learned to read stillness. Atlas read it perfectly. His body stayed coiled, but his tail lowered a fraction, trusting the cadence of Jack's breathing. A working dog's moral compass had no language, only pattern recognition and memory. This pattern meant hold. The corridor smelled like disinfectant, wet nylon, and adrenaline. A second volunteer lifted her phone, lens shaking less now, and pointed it at Carson's hand on Lena's throat. The first volunteer mirrored her from the opposite wall. 2 angles, clear visual. They stopped pretending they were filming the dog. The deputy with the dormant body cam saw the phones and finally hit record. That was the second correction in the room. Carson caught the movement and snapped, "Put those down!" He kept squeezing while he spoke, voice climbing. "You don't record me in my own property action." A tiny sound escaped Lena, half cough, half laugh, because he had said the quiet part out loud. Property action, not safety inspection, not lawful transfer. A seizure with witnesses and uniforms for decoration. Jack's gaze flicked to the papers in Carson's free hand, then to the county seal, then back to Carson's grip. His expression did not change, but Lena saw the conclusion arrive. The documents mattered. The hand on her throat mattered more. Immediate threat first. Paper trail after. The older deputy cleared his throat and addressed Carson, not Jack. "Maybe ease up," he said. "No need for force." Carson stared at him like he had betrayed a contract. The deputy held his stare for 3 seconds, then looked away first, but he did not retract the words. Lena felt another thin ribbon of air slip in. Not enough. Better than nothing. Her fingertips were still tingling, but the tunnel at the edge of her vision widened by a shade. She heard Atlas's nails click once on concrete as he adjusted away from his bad hip, stubborn and balanced despite pain. He had been listed as temperament decline when the disposition center tried to write him off. Jack had read the file and seen untreated injury and abandoned grief. 2 years of paperwork and pressure had brought him here instead of a needle. Carson was still talking because he had never had to stop. "Deputies, remove him," he said, jerking his chin at Jack while keeping Lena pinned. "Now, he is interfering with county enforcement." No one touched Jack. No one touched Atlas. A soundless beat passed, long enough for everyone to feel it. In that beat, the corridor's hierarchy turned inside out. Badges and titles and donor names were still physically present, but they no longer controlled the next second. A retired chief in soaked camouflage and an old shepherd with a torn hip had taken that control simply by standing there and refusing to be managed. Jack finally spoke, voice low and level, 3 words that did not need volume to carry. Let her go. Hold that moment right there, because this is where a lot of people decide whether they are witnesses or participants. Tell us where you're watching from, because towns like Ridgemont are everywhere, and people like Lena are doing hard work in all of them. If you believe veterans and working dogs should not be erased by donor plaques and forged paperwork, subscribe and stay with the story to the end. What happened after those 3 words did not just stop one man's hand. It exposed the machinery behind it. The corridor froze in a geometry of choices. Carson had not released her yet. His thumb was still planted above Lena's collarbone, but his confidence had developed a crack, thin and bright as ice under pressure. He had expected compliance from uniforms and silence from staff. He had expected a neat transfer at 3:07 a.m., before daylight and reporters and lawyers. What he got instead was a room that had begun documenting him from multiple angles while his own lines about ownership sat in the air like admissions. Lena drew another shallow breath and felt pain radiate up the side of her neck. She knew the signs: bruising around the larynx by morning, voice rough for days, swallow pain by sunrise. She logged it the way medics did because naming injury gave it boundaries. She kept her gaze on Jack and counted his breathing cadence. In through the nose, controlled exhale, no wasted movement. Atlas matched him, chest lifting in a slower rhythm than his adrenaline wanted. Across the glass in observation, one code officer mouthed something to another and pointed at the posted emergency map. Not to help Lena, to locate legal cover. They had spent years weaponizing procedure against people without money, and now procedure had become a trap for them too. Filmed assault during an enforcement action. Deputies present, county seals visible, timestamps everywhere. In the back office down the secured hall, beneath a folded Marine Corps blanket, a 9-year-old boy slept through the first part of this. That detail mattered more than Carson understood. The facility was not a hollow parcel waiting for luxury renderings. It was kennels, meds, rehab schedules, grant binders, a cot, a cereal bowl in a sink, and one operations director who had been carrying 3 jobs on 1 paycheck. It was a place built from service records and stubbornness, from dogs the system had used hard and tried to discard when their joints gave out. Carson had tried to call that blight. The volunteers by the lockers were no longer pretending this was standard county business. One kept filming, arms steady now. Another had moved to Atlas's flank with an open hand low at her side, asking permission with posture, not touch. Atlas did not look at her. His focus stayed on Carson's wrists. The younger clerk finally lifted the desk phone and keyed a line she had been afraid to dial 30 seconds earlier. She spoke softly, eyes on the floor. State investigator intake, she whispered when the call connected. Active assault during county enforcement. We have video. External contact made. The deputy with white at his temples heard her and did not stop her. He reached for his radio instead and gave a clipped location update to dispatch, voice stripped of swagger. Needs supervisor at Ridgemont Veterans K-9 Rehab. Immediate. Second contact made. No one in that corridor could claim later that nothing happened, not with 2 phone recordings running, a body cam active, radio traffic logged, and a state line open. Evidence had begun to harden while Carson still had his hand on Lena. Jack kept his weight centered and his hands visible. That was the part civilians often missed about real control. It wasn't noise or posture or threat displays. It was removing ambiguity one variable at a time. He had already mapped Carson's base, wrist angle, elbow position, proximity to wall, and the half-step needed to break leverage without throwing Lena to the floor. He waited only for the fraction where Carson's grip shifted from compression to reaction. Atlas's ears pinned forward again, body rigid, growl building. Jack's fingers tightened on the leash once. Lena saw Carson read none of it, and all of it in the same second. His mouth curled like he wanted to sneer, but he swallowed first. Tiny movement. Visible fear trying to disguise itself as contempt. He chose contempt. "You don't order me," Carson said, louder for the room. "My father owns this hospital system, the judges, the land under this building. By sunrise, you'll all be gone." One of the code officers behind glass closed his eyes briefly, then opened them and looked away. Loaded setup paid off. He had nodded earlier when Carson threatened the room. Now he looked like a man calculating whether cooperation statements were still on the table. Jack did not blink. Lena felt the pressure change under Carson's hand, not released but repositioned for emphasis, as he tried to reassert dominance with force. That was the shift Jack had been waiting on. Not a dramatic move. A quarter-inch change in thumb pressure and elbow angle. Enough. The next second would decide everything that came after, and the files, calls, and recordings accumulating in real time were already turning a family name that had ruled Ridgemont for 20 years from untouchable myth into evidence. Now let's go back to the beginning, because a hand on a throat at 3:07 a.m. never started at 3:07 a.m. Lena Ortiz was 29, 5'4", compact in the way people became when they carried weight for too many years, and she ran the Ridgemont Veterans K-9 Rehabilitation Facility on caffeine, grant deadlines, and discipline she had learned in sand-choked casualty tents. She had been a Navy trauma medic before she became an operations director, and the habits never left her. She still counted compressions under her breath when she was stressed. She still scanned exits before she sat down. She still slept in 90-minute fragments unless she was too exhausted to dream. Her emotional wound had two names, and she carried both at work. Marisol, her older sister, gone after a winter highway rollover that should have been survivable if the ambulance had arrived 10 minutes sooner. And the men she had treated on deployment, whose names arrived in her head at sink faucets, in grocery lines, in the half-second between waking and memory. She did not talk about any of that in public. She talked about kennels, feed schedules, anti-inflammatory dosing, and HVAC repairs. The facility sat on 11 acres of cold concrete, chain-link runs, rehab yards, and one low administrative wing that smelled like disinfectant and wet fur in winter and dust-warmed metal in summer. The dogs there were retired military working dogs and contract search dogs that institutions had finished using. Some limped, some startled at clanging gates, some had old blast injuries hidden under disciplined posture. Lena's job was intake, rehab logistics, donor compliance, volunteer staffing, and the kind of midnight crisis management that never appeared on brochures. She was also the one who knew which dog would eat only if a radio played softly in the corner, and which dog needed 3 full minutes of stillness before a leash clip could touch his collar. By the second week of October, she had started sleeping in the back office, 4 nights out of 7, because vandalism calls and inspection threats kept arriving after midnight. Her 9-year-old nephew, Mateo, slept there too on the worst nights. curled on a cot beneath a folded Marine Corps blanket that had belonged to Lena's father. There was a chipped blue mug on Lena's desk, always with cold coffee in it, and a second mug with cocoa residue because Mateo insisted grown-ups forgot sweetness on purpose. His math workbook lived under her grant binders. His sneakers were usually lined up under the cot with a precision he copied from her without knowing why. The domestic details were small enough to miss if you did not look. They were also the entire point. The facility was not abstract property. It was people and routines stitched together against collapse. Atlas trusted two sets of hands in that building, Lena's and Jack Brooks's. The dog had tolerated everyone else. He obeyed commands from trained staff. He accepted care. But trust was different. Trust was Atlas letting Lena check his left hip on cold mornings without tensing first. Trust was Atlas putting his weight into Jack's leg when thunder rolled over Ridgemont and the windows shook. Atlas's service file could have been a plaque in any patriotic hallway if anyone had bothered to read it carefully. 8 years old, German Shepherd, 5 deployments, 23 Americans found alive during compound breaches and post-blast rubble searches, shrapnel through the left hip during Kandahar extraction, partial hearing loss in the right ear from overpressure, administrative note, temperament decline. Lena had read that phrase and thrown the folder on her desk hard enough to rattle a stapler, because pain and grief were not temperament failures, not in dogs, not in people. Jack had fought for Atlas through 2 years of disposition center paperwork, while Lena built the facility around dogs like him. Their first real conversation happened at 2:11 a.m. on a sleeting March night when Atlas refused to cross the intake threshold because a metal cart had crashed in the corridor and triggered a memory no one could see. Jack had stood 5 feet away in NWU Type 3 camouflage, rain dripping from his cuffs, and said only one word. "Easy." Atlas crossed. Lena wrote that down in a spiral notebook she kept hidden in a drawer labeled Invoices, because she trusted data when everything else felt unstable. She wrote down what sounds triggered Atlas, which pressure points he avoided, what time his pain flare usually started when barometric pressure dropped. She also wrote down every unofficial call she received from county offices asking routine questions about occupancy load, septic permits, nuisance noise, and emergency egress. Pattern mattered. Sequence mattered. Institutions rarely kicked doors in. They papered them to death first. 3 days passed before the first code citation arrived by courier. 7 more before a second arrived with conflicting requirements. Then came the sheriff, overtime, civil standby notices attached to nothing actionable, always scheduled during donor tours or adoption events, always with just enough uniform presence to rattle volunteers and make older veterans leave early. Lena submitted responses with attachments, timestamps, and legal references. She kept duplicates in a fireproof box under her desk, another set in cloud storage, and a third on an encrypted drive taped beneath the supply cabinet. She had learned in uniform that if it wasn't documented, it hadn't happened. She had learned in Ridgemont that if it threatened money, documentation could vanish unless you protected it like a patient airway. Carson Prescott appeared in person only after paper pressure had softened the room. He was 31 and wore wealth the way some men wore rank insignia. Designer sneakers that had never touched mud. A camel coat with hand stitching visible at the seams. $400 sunglasses even under gray rain. He walked through institutional spaces as if hallways were built for his stride, and people were movable fixtures. He smiled when he made threats, and that made him more dangerous than loud men. Loud men wanted reaction. Carson wanted compliance performed in front of witnesses. It gave him the feeling of permanence. His father, Miles Prescott, had built that permanence one plaque at a time. Prescott Development owned logistics yards, mixed-use blocks, and half-finished luxury projects with names borrowed from forests they had replaced. The family surname sat in brushed steel over the Prescott Pavilion at Ridgemont General. It sat on donor walls at the Civic Arts Center, the Youth Complex, and the County Innovation Lab no one in town could explain. Miles chaired one hospital foundation board, funded sheriff training equipment, underwrote zoning retreats, and hosted private breakfasts where city managers returned calls before 9. None of it was illegal by itself. That was the architecture's genius. Influence distributed across legal channels looked like community leadership until someone stood where Lena stood and watched each channel bend at the same target. Carson inherited the system as if it were genetic law. When he was 24, he shoved a resident physician against a medication cart at Prescott Pavilion after being told visiting hours were over. Security footage disappeared within 48 hours. The incident report was amended to verbal misunderstanding. When he was 27, a wetlands grading complaint tied to one of his projects drew 3 agency flags and a temporary halt order. 2 weeks later, the halt evaporated under a revised environmental memo, signed by a consultant newly added to a county advisory role. When he was 30, he threatened a school board contractor in a parking garage over a bid dispute and was captured on elevator video saying, "My family writes your budget." The contractor withdrew the complaint. No charges. People in Ridgemont learned the lesson. Not one event would destroy you. The accumulation might. By late November, Carson had decided the K9 facility parcel belonged in his next project map. The land sat near rail access and 2 arterial roads, with enough footprint for a branded luxury campus pitched to out-of-town investors. His shell entity, North Bend Renewal LLC, filed preliminary interest claims through intermediaries who had never visited the property. Then came easement questions, title challenges, and sudden assertions that emergency access routes were non-compliant, despite being county-approved for years. The legal strategy was not a clean seizure. It was attrition. Make operations unstable, increase carrying costs, frighten insurers, exhaust staff, force voluntary transition before daylight could bring scrutiny. Lena saw the pattern and called who she could. She called the state veterans liaison twice and received procedural guidance with no enforcement teeth. She called a legal aid clinic that warned her quietly that local counsel often conflicted out when Prescott entities were involved. She called a former procurement officer she trusted from her Navy years and asked him to review filing chains. He called back 41 minutes later and said, "This is coordinated." She called Jack and did not leave voicemail because he always answered on the second ring when she called after midnight. External contacts logged, outcomes mixed. None of them stopped the pressure. Across those same weeks, Carson tightened his local cover. County deputies got overtime civil standby assignments at odd hours. Code officers arrived with tablets preloaded to citation pages before entering buildings. Dispatch logs started labeling routine welfare checks as potential hostile encounters when filed against veteran-run sites. The language did quiet work. It reframed who was presumed dangerous before anyone crossed the threshold. The facility volunteers felt it first. A retired Army mechanic who usually ran enrichment drills told Lena he was taking a break because his wife feared getting on the wrong list. A college intern stopped wearing facility logos in public after being followed from a grocery lot by a black SUV registered to a Prescott subcontractor. One donor backed out of a winter heating grant after receiving an anonymous packet implying financial irregularities that did not exist. Good people kept apologizing while stepping away, not because they were cruel, because pressure works when it is patient. Carson counted on that patience. He started making personal appearances exactly once every 10 days, always with an assistant and always with documents in hand. He walked intake halls with survey confidence, pointing at walls and saying things like, "This wing becomes concierge rehab," and "that yard gets converted to resident amenities." He referred to retired military dogs as inventory. He called long-term care costs dead cash. Lena corrected him once, voice flat, saying, "They're veterans." He smiled and said, "They're liabilities." That line made one volunteer cry in the supply closet after shift change. By the first week of December, Lena had enough to suspect that several county filings connected to North Bend renewal were altered after submission. Metadata mismatched timestamps, notary blocks repeated across unrelated documents. A scanned easement signature belonged to a former landowner who had been dead for 6 years. Lena exported everything, verified hash values, and uploaded duplicate evidence archives to a state intake portal at 1:42 a.m., then sent mirrored copies to 2 outside contacts with instructions to release if her local access was interrupted. She did it quietly, in scrub pants and wool socks, with Mateo asleep 10 feet away and Atlas breathing on the rug by the door. That was 6 hours before Carson arrived with foreclosure papers and civil standby uniforms. He thought Dawn would protect him. He thought his father's name on a hospital wing and a dozen donor walls was stronger than one medic with a cloud archive, one retired chief with no appetite for intimidation, and one German shepherd who still knew exactly how to read the difference between noise and danger. He also thought the parcel was abandoned leverage waiting for acquisition. He had no idea it was a memorial structure with legal teeth deeded under a veteran protection reversion clause by Ryan Keene's mother years earlier, drafted to trigger state review the moment non-veteran commercial transfer was attempted. Miles Prescott's attorneys had missed that clause because they never believed anyone outside their circle could outpaper them. Carson never read far enough into the chain to notice what he was touching. In his world, signatures were shields. In Lena's world, signatures were evidence. In Jack's world, evidence plus timing became consequence. So when Carson stood in that corridor and announced ownership, he was not naming power. He was activating his own collapse on record in front of 14 witnesses, under 2 phone cameras, 1 body cam, 1 dispatch channel, and 1 state intake case already open with his filings attached. And back in the corridor, with his thumb still at Lena's throat, and Jack already inside his angle, that legal machinery had begun to move. Lena saw Jack's right hand flex once on Atlas's leash, and the knuckles whitened in a pattern she recognized from nights when pain and restraint fought for the same inch of skin. She had seen that hand split open in a sink at 2:40 a.m. 2 winters earlier, when a dropped stainless bowl in Kennel Run B had sent 3 retired dogs into panic barking and thrown Atlas backward into a gate. Jack had arrived in soaked NWU Type 3s, no jacket, jaw scar bright against wind-burned skin, and he had crouched beside Atlas without a word until the dog's breathing slowed. Afterward, when the corridor quieted, Lena found Jack in the staff washroom running cold water over his palm, where he had clenched too hard on a broken leash clip. He wrapped gauze one-handed, precise and silent, the way men did who had patched themselves between missions because nobody could be spared. "You need stitches," Lena had said. "Not tonight," he said. She handed him steri strips anyway. "You always say that." He met her eyes in the spotted mirror. "I don't sleep if I go home right now." That was the first time he admitted it straight. He didn't offer details then. He never offered details first. They came in fragments over months, between med rounds and grant calls. While coffee went cold and Atlas kept one ear canted toward every door, Jack was 38, retired SEAL chief, broad through the shoulders from work, not gym vanity, dark hair cut close with early gray at the temples, and an old scar crossing his jawline like a pale seam someone had tried to erase badly. He carried other damage where no one could photograph it. Hellman had given him a left shoulder that locked in wet weather, tinnitus that turned fluorescent lights into a permanent edge tone, and a sleep cycle shredded into 90-minute blocks by memory and vigilance. Ryan Keene's name was the center of all of it. Lena learned that one storm night when freezing rain tapped the office windows and Atlas refused to settle on his mat. Jack sat on the floor with his back to the file cabinet, knees up, one hand on Atlas's neck. The facility smelled like antiseptic and wet dog and burnt coffee. Mateo was asleep in the back room, breathing soft and even under the marine blanket. Jack stared at the closed office door for a long time, as if he were waiting for permission from someone no longer alive. "Dust storm closed the bird lane," he said at last. "We had him packaged, airway managed, bleed controlled. 19 minutes to the LZ, then 38, then 43. Lena didn't interrupt. "Ryan kept asking if we got the dog out first," Jack said. "Not himself. The dog." His voice stayed level, which made it worse. "He knew the answer before I said it." Atlas shifted, pressing harder into Jack's thigh. Jack kept his eyes on nothing. "He died hearing rotors that never came close enough." The room stayed still, except for rain and radiator hiss. Lena had worked enough trauma to know the difference between grief and confession. Grief repeated the ending. Confession repeated the decision points. Jack carried both. By the first week of January that year, he had started driving to the facility after midnight instead of trying to force sleep in his apartment. He parked under the dead floodlight near supply intake, did perimeter checks nobody asked for, then sat in Kennel Run A with Atlas until dawn thinned the windows. He said the silence at home was worse than noise. In quiet rooms, his brain filled the gaps with rotor wash, radio static, and Ryan calling range to landing under a sky that never opened. The Navy had offered treatment, and he took some of it. EMDR sessions, sleep protocols, group rooms where men spoke in clipped timelines and stared at carpet seams. He attended, did the work, and still woke at 1:13, 2:47, 4:02 as if an internal watch officer kept resetting alarms to danger hours. Hypervigilance had no off switch. It just changed uniforms. One Thursday, months before Carson tried to claim the building, Lena found Jack at the intake desk with a stack of disposition center denial letters spread in exact alignment. Atlas lay at his boots, chin on paws, eyes open. "Another rejection?" she asked. Jack tapped the top page. "Temperament risk. Civilian placement not recommended." "They've never seen him here." "They've seen a file," he said. "File says unpredictable under acoustic stress." Lena sat across from him and read the language. The phrases were bureaucratic and bloodless, designed to sound objective while hiding neglect. Recommended euthanasia if secure placement unavailable. She felt heat climb her neck. Appeal," she said. "8th one. 9th then." His mouth almost moved toward a smile, then settled back. "You always this stubborn?" "When the system is lazy, yes." They built the 9th appeal that night. Lena attached veterinary assessments, pain management logs, trigger mitigation plans, and incident reports that proved Atlas de-escalated when handled by trained personnel. Jack wrote the handler's statement in block letters, each line spare and factual. MWD Atlas responded to command under stress. MWD Atlas alerted to hidden threats in blind search at higher than unit average across 5 deployments. MWD Atlas exhibited pain response mischaracterized as aggression following untreated hip trauma. He stopped writing halfway through and set the pen down. Lena waited. He saved my element lead in Kandahar, Jack said quietly. IED secondary was wired into the doorway. Atlas sat hard and wouldn't move. We lost 30 seconds arguing with him. 30 seconds cleared the dust enough to see the line. Put it in, Lena said. Doesn't change the board. It changes the record. Jack picked up the pen again. 3 days later, the board denied the appeal with a form email, time-stamped 6:12 a.m. Jack read it in the corridor outside hydrotherapy and did not speak for a full minute. Atlas watched his face, then rose and pressed his head into Jack's sternum until Jack's breathing evened out. That was the first time Lena saw the dog perform the gesture like protocol, as if he had learned in some blast-broken place that this was how you kept your human from tipping over the edge. By late February, Jack escalated outside the local chain. He called a former command master chief who owed Ryan Keene a debt. He sent certified packets to a congressional veterans liaison. He sat through 2 review panels where men in press shirts asked whether he could guarantee non-incident outcomes in civilian settings, and he answered in the same calm tone every time. No one can guarantee outcomes, he said. I can guarantee standards. One panelist glanced at Atlas through the glass and said, Why this dog? Jack's jaw tightened around the scar. Because we don't abandon teammates when paperwork gets inconvenient. Lena never forgot the silence that followed. The approval came 11 days later, not because the institution had suddenly grown a conscience, but because enough documented pressure made denial costlier than release. Jack signed the transfer in the same intake corridor where Carson now stood with his hand on Lena's throat. The date still sat in faded marker on the whiteboard behind the desk. Atlas had limped across that concrete, paused at the threshold, and leaned against Jack's leg with his full 80-plus pounds, like a man testing whether the bridge would hold. It held. Back in the present, Lena tasted copper and saw that same pressure in Jack's hand now. The same fight between memory and control. He stood 6 feet of contained force in digital camouflage, darkened by rain, sleeplessness carved under his eyes, grief welded into discipline so thoroughly it looked like temperament from the outside. Men like Carson read that as passivity until it was too late. Lena had watched enough hard rooms to know better. Jack's quiet was not hesitation. It was target discrimination. It was the last safe second before action. Atlas lifted his chin 1 inch, waiting for the next command that would come, as it always had, in the smallest number of words needed to keep someone alive. The corridor's fluorescent hum cut through Lena's ears, and memory shifted to the dog himself, to the file that had called him a liability, and the bodies that file had once pulled out breathing. Atlas had entered military service at 14 months with drives so clean evaluators flagged him for high-threat detection and confined space work by the end of his first assessment cycle. Lena knew the details because she had printed his redacted record and read it in the admin office at 1:19 a.m., page edges digging crescents into her thumbs while wind hit the siding hard enough to rattle vents. 8 years old now. German Shepherd. 5 deployments. 23 Americans located alive in compound breaches. collapsed mud structures, and post-detonation debris fields where dust turned noon into dusk. In debrief language, those were successful finds. In human language, they were fathers and medics and radio operators who got to go home because a dog sat, barked once, and refused to move. The first time Lena heard the full sequence from someone who had been there, it came from Chief Warrant Officer Dan Mercer during a quarterly welfare review. Mercer smelled like cigar smoke and old wool, wore reading glasses he kept losing on top of his head, and spoke about Atlas with the careful respect soldiers reserved for the dead and the irreplaceable. Coast, spring cycle, Mercer had said, tapping a line in the file. Two-story mud compound took indirect. Team thought interior void was empty. Atlas took one pass, doubled back, started pawing at a collapsed threshold. Handler thought false positive. Atlas sat again and did the short bark. They dug 20 minutes and pulled a comm specialist out with a pelvic fracture and one functioning lung. He turned the page. Kandahar, District 9 perimeter sweep. Secondary device wired low, under blown door frame, pressure initiation. Atlas hard stopped at 6 feet and braced. Didn't break posture, even with small arms popping 3 lots over. Saved the stack. Lena looked up from the file. That's where his hip went? Mercer nodded once. Shrapnel during exfil after a separate breach same week. Left side. Missed femoral by grace and bad geometry. Atlas, lying under the conference table during that meeting, shifted his left leg like he could feel the words. Pain became the hidden chapter in his record after retirement. The disposition notes said, reactive to metallic clatter and resistant to handling under stress. They did not say that cold made the scar tissue tighten until he could not put full weight on the left rear without tremor. They did not say partial hearing loss in his right ear meant sudden sounds arrived crooked. Location uncertain, danger everywhere at once. They did not say he had lost his original handler to a stateside training accident 2 months before decommissioning and spent 14 days refusing meals from anyone else. Jack had learned all of that by observation before he ever got official access. In those first adoption months, he and Lena built Atlas back one trigger at a time. Rubber mats over concrete in run C to reduce hip flare. Slow leash approach from the left side so the right ear deficit didn't force surprise. Metal bowl desensitization with controlled drops at distance, then reward, then repetition, until Atlas stopped scanning the ceiling for incoming shock waves. On bad weather nights, Jack sat with him through every thunder roll, palm on chest, matching breath rate. When Atlas startled, Jack did not correct first, he anchored first. One night in April, a volunteer dropped a stainless gate latch, and Atlas spun hard, slammed his shoulder into chain link, and bared teeth in blind panic at empty air. 2 people backed away fast. One shouted for a muzzle. Jack stepped into Atlas's line, knees bent, voice flat. Atlas, here. The dog froze, vibrating, eyes blown wide. Here, Jack said again, quieter. Atlas took 2 stiff steps and pressed into Jack's leg, trembling all the way down. Jack sank with him to the floor, one hand behind the ears, one at the collarbone, waiting out the surge without force. Lena knelt nearby with a blanket and anti-inflammatory ready, watching Atlas's breathing count down from combat tempo to kennel tempo in long, painful increments. After, the volunteer who had yelled looked stricken. I thought he was going to bite. He thought he was back there, Lena said. She never forgot how Jack answered, still crouched on the concrete. Fear and aggression are not the same event. By the second week of May, Atlas began initiating contact with Mateo at morning feed, nudging the boy's elbow until he laughed and scratched behind his left ear where the scar tissue was thinner. That mattered to Lena more than any evaluation metric. Dogs did not fake trust with children. Atlas chose his circles carefully, and when he chose Mateo, he chose the whole place. Medical reviews documented progress in sterile language. Weight stable, reactivity reduced, mobility improved with hydrotherapy compliance. What they could not document was moral weight. A decorated MWD nearly erased by paperwork because his body carried the cost of service too visibly for budget comfort. 23 lives found, and the reward had nearly been a syringe in a quiet room. Lena filed every update anyway. Evidence did not have to be poetic to be devastating when lined up correctly. Now, in the corridor at 3:07 a.m., Atlas stood with his tan and black coat catching sodium light in dull gold and shadow black. Ribs still sore from Carson's boot. Old hip likely burning from cold concrete and tension. He held position at Jack's knee, not because he was unhurt, but because duty had been his first language and loyalty his last. His ears stayed pinned forward. His body stayed locked. The growl in his chest rolled low enough that the chain link seemed to hum with it. Carson still didn't understand what he was looking at. He saw an aging dog and a tired veteran in wet camouflage. Lena saw 5 deployments, a Kandahar wound, 1,000 nights of unthanked vigilance, and a bond forged in places where hesitation got people killed. She saw the same thing in Jack, a man who had failed to save one teammate and had built the rest of his life around never failing the one still breathing. Atlas shifted half a step to protect Jack's blind side near the security door. Muscle memory from years of stacking and crossing thresholds in hostile spaces. Forgotten heroes did not forget their jobs. Forgotten heroes did not forget their jobs. And in that corridor, the truth of that sat heavier than badges, county seals, or the Prescott crest glinting on a cuffling pressed against Lena's jaw. Carson's grip stayed on her throat, but it was no longer the grip of a man certain the room belonged to him. It had tiny tremors now, little corrections at the thumb and first knuckle as he tried to hold pressure and posture at the same time. Lena felt each one through bruised tissue and counted them the way she counted pulse deficits in triage. Her airway was still narrowed to a harsh ribbon. Her swallow burned. Yet the panic that had flooded her 2 minutes earlier began to thin, replaced by a colder focus, sharpened by everything she knew. Mateo asleep behind 2 secured doors, Atlas taking pain on a rebuilt hip, Jack carrying Helmand in his bones, and still choosing precision over rage. The fluorescent hum sounded like a wire under strain. 14 witnesses had become 14 records in her mind. The deputy with white at the temples had cleared the lane. The younger clerk had made the state call. The volunteer in gray had stopped staring at the mop bucket and was filming steady now, elbows locked, lens fixed on Carson's hand placement and Lena's face color. Behind observation glass, one code officer's tablet remained lifted, but his chin had lowered and his shoulders had folded in on themselves. The body language of a man already drafting his own denial statement. The second code officer had retreated half a step from the doorframe and kept glancing at the emergency map like it might grant him absolution. Nobody looked bored anymore. Nobody looked away for long. Atlas held at Jack's knee, chest low, sound rolling in his rib cage like distant storm. His right ear tracked a half beat behind the left when Kennel Run C rattled. Old overpressured damage still writing static through his world. His left rear leg quivered once when weight shifted across the Kandahar scar line, then locked again. Duty over pain. Again. Lena pulled one thin breath and got enough oxygen to think in complete sentences. That changed what she saw. Carson wasn't pinning her because he needed control of her body. He was pinning her because he could feel control of the narrative slipping and had no other language. Men raised inside purchased certainty, always reached for force when witnesses stopped agreeing. She looked past him at Jack and read the familiar map. Door angles, holster positions, glass reflections, loose objects on the floor, who might panic and dart into the lane. His eyes moved once across the room and settled back on Carson's wrist. No wasted motion. No speech to fill fear. Tactical math running quiet behind a steady face. By 3:09 a.m., dispatch had acknowledged the deputy's supervisor request and assigned a sergeant to scene with an 8-minute ETA. The radio chirp came thin and metallic from the deputy's shoulder mic. It landed in the room like a second lock engaging. Carson heard it. Lena felt his pulse jump, where his palm touched her neck. He pretended not to hear and shoved the foreclosure packet higher against her cheek, paper edge cutting skin just under her eye. "You're done here," he said, voice pitched for the room. "Every one of you. These structures are red-tagged, transfer is filed, and I can have contempt warrants signed before sunrise for interference." He wanted that sentence recorded. He got his wish. The volunteer nearest the lockers whispered, "Keep rolling," to no one in particular. The second volunteer shifted right to capture Carson's face and the county seal in the same frame. Evidence, discipline. Lena thought through the pain. Someone had finally remembered sequence and context matter. Jack's breathing never changed. In through nose. Controlled exhale. Atlas matched him, though the dog's chest hitched once as a pain wave crossed his flank from the kick. Lena tasted copper and bleach, then forced words through a throat that felt packed with sand. "He assaulted me," she rasped. "On camera." The younger clerk at intake lifted her free hand without looking up and said, voice shaking, "State intake logged. Case number issued." Her eyes flicked to Lena for half a second, then back to the desk. "I sent the cloud link. External contact outcome. Confirmed." One deputy swore softly under his breath, not at Lena, at the timing. He knew exactly what that meant. State investigators now had a live case, metadata, and real-time corroboration from the scene he was standing in. Civil standby had just turned into a liability corridor. Carson swung his head toward the intake desk, hand still on Lena. "Hang up that phone," he snapped. "You don't file anything without counsel present." The clerk didn't move. The older deputy said, "Sir, you need to release her." He said it louder this time, with rank in the tone instead of suggestion. Carson stared at him like he had spoken in the wrong language. "You take orders from the county contract," he said. "My father signs your equipment grants." There it was again. Ownership as grammar, power as inheritance. He expected that sentence to return him to center. It didn't. Jack stepped one pace closer. Boots silent on wet concrete, shoulders square, hands still visible. Atlas rose a fraction with him, from low coil to full working height, 80-plus pounds of trained restraint and old scars, tan and black coat flashing gold at the edge of light and iron dark in shadow. His growl dropped lower, so low Lena felt it in her sternum more than her ears. Carson finally looked directly at Jack. He found no argument there. No performance. Just a calm that had already accounted for consequence and accepted it. That was the look men like Carson never met in boardrooms, private clubs, or donor dinners. It unsettled him instantly, though he tried to hide it with a half-smile. Jack spoke, voice quiet enough that everyone leaned in to catch it. "Last warning." 2 words were enough. They made it procedural. Carson barked a laugh that came out brittle. "Warning from who? You?" He jerked his chin toward the deputies without breaking grip. "Tell him who runs this town. Tell him whose name is on your training center, your hospital wing, your courthouse renovation." He looked back at Jack, lips curling. I can call Judge Harlan right now. I can call Sheriff Dade. I can have you trespassed in 6 minutes. Jack didn't answer. That silence was not empty. It was verdict waiting for timing. Lena watched Carson process the silence and failed to categorize it. People had always answered him, argued, pleaded, threatened back, explained themselves. Jack did none of those. He held eye contact and gave Carson nothing to push against. For the first time since grabbing her, Carson's focus fractured. His gaze flicked to Atlas, then to the phones filming, then to the deputy body cam now blinking red, then back to Jack. The fracture widened. Atlas took one deliberate step forward into heel alignment, shoulder even with Jack's leg, head level with Carson's hip. He did not lunge. He did not bare teeth. He simply occupied space with the confidence of an MWD who had done this under rounds and smoke. His ears pinned forward, body rigid, growl building in measured pulses. Jack's fingers tightened once on the leash tab and released. "Control that dog," Carson said, but his voice had thinned. No one moved to help him this time. From down the secure hall came a small sound. A door latch clicking open, then a child's sleepy cough. Lena's heart kicked hard against Carson's hand. Mateo was awake. She turned her eyes toward the sound and saw, at the far threshold, a small silhouette under a marine blanket, one fist rubbing one eye. He froze when he saw the corridor full of uniforms, phones, and Atlas braced for conflict. The volunteer nearest the hall whispered, "Hey, buddy, stay there," and held out a hand without taking her camera off Carson. Carson followed Lena's glance, saw the boy, and made his worst mistake of the night. He smirked. "Good," he said. "He can watch you sign." The room changed again. The older deputy took one step toward Carson and stopped only when Jack's hand lifted a quarter inch, not a command, just lane control. The deputy understood and held. Lena's fear burned off into something cleaner. "Do not talk to him," she said, voice shredded but steady. Carson pressed harder, angry now that his threats were not restoring order. "You don't set terms." Jack moved his gaze from Carson's eyes to Carson's hand on Lena's throat, then back. "Release," he said. One word. Flat. Final. Carson squared his shoulders, trying to perform dominance for cameras that were no longer his. "Make me." He shifted his thumb to increase compression and turned his elbow outward for the leverage. That quarter-inch adjustment gave Jack everything he needed. What happened next was fast enough to feel like a cut in time and clean enough that even the deputies recognized professional control. Jack stepped inside Carson's frame on a .45, trapped the wrist at the base of the thumb, rotated the elbow across its weak line, and stripped the hold without striking Lena or driving Carson into the wall. Carson's hand came off her throat in one efficient arc. Paper scattered across concrete. The sound was dry and sharp, like cards snapped from a deck. Lena stumbled one step, sucked air hard, coughed twice, and stayed on her feet by force. Atlas shifted instantly, body angling between her and Carson. No contact, just barrier. Protective geometry. The dog's eyes never left Carson's hands. Carson made a strangled sound, more shock than pain, and tried to wrench free. Jack maintained control with minimal pressure, wrist pinned, elbow bent, weight centered. No flourish, no anger, just inevitability. "Don't," Jack said. Carson looked up into Jack's face from inches away and finally saw it. Not rage, not bluff. The steady, exhausted certainty of someone who had stood in worse places and had no fear left for donor names. In Jack's eyes, Carson saw that every move ahead had already been calculated, that every witness in the hall had turned from audience to record, and that the family machinery he had trusted was now pointed the other direction. The smirk fell off him like a mask cut loose. "Get him off me," Carson said, but this time he said it to the room, not as an order, as a plea disguised as command. No one rushed in. The deputy body cam kept blinking. Phones kept recording. Dispatch traffic kept logging. The state intake line stayed open on speaker at the clerk's desk, a distant voice asking for visual confirmation of injuries and parties present. One of the code officers behind glass lowered his tablet and sat down hard in a plastic chair, color drained from his face. Lena put a hand to her throat and drew another full breath, then another, pain sharp but airway open. She looked at Mateo at the hall threshold and nodded once so he would see her standing. Atlas heard the small hitch in her breathing and glanced back for half a second, then returned to Carson. In that half second, the corridor's power map finalized. Prescott money, county uniforms, code tablets, donor plaques, all of it had lost command over the next choice. A retired chief in wet camouflage and an aging German shepherd had taken it by discipline, evidence, and timing, and Carson Prescott understood at last that he was no longer the man deciding what happened here. Carson twisted again, and Jack shifted with him, redirecting the force into the wall and pinning the wrist at shoulder height until the joints stopped fighting. "Hands visible," the older deputy said, voice cutting clean through the corridor. He stepped in now, finally, cuffs already out. "Mr. Prescott, you are being detained for assault." Carson stared at him, stunned first, then furious. "You don't detain me," he said. "Call my father. Call Sheriff Dade. Right now." The deputy answered by nodding once to his partner. "Cuff him." The deputy who had scrolled his phone earlier hesitated for one beat, then holstered the phone and took Carson's free arm. Metal clicked. Carson's shoulders jerked when the cuffs closed, disbelief flattening his face. He looked past the deputy to the code officers behind glass, as if one of them would restore the old rules. Neither moved. By 3:17 a.m., Sergeant Mills had arrived, taken one look at Lena's bruising, the body cam light, the 2 volunteer recordings, and the state investigators still on speaker, and turned the civil standby scene into an evidence scene. "Nobody leaves," Mills said. "Phones out, names on record, devices preserved. This is now a criminal hold." The younger clerk, hands still shaking, read the state case number again so everyone heard it. She gave Mills the cloud archive receipt Lena had uploaded at 1:42 a.m., complete with hash verification and timestamp. Lena pointed, voice raw, toward the admin office. "Fireproof box under desk, encrypted drive taped beneath the supply cabinet, duplicate filings and originals." Mills sent a deputy and one code officer to retrieve both under camera. They came back with the dented red lockbox and the black drive sealed in clear evidence plastic. The volunteer in gray, the one who had stared into the mop bucket, stepped forward and surrendered her phone without being asked twice. "I film from first contact," she said. "Uncut." "Thank you," Mills said, and wrote her name. The code officer, who had nodded when Carson threatened the room, kept his mouth tight until Mills asked him directly, "Were these condemnation papers pre-filled before entry?" The man swallowed, looked once at Carson in cuffs, then at the tablet in his own hands. "Yes," he said quietly. "We were instructed to execute, not inspect." "By who?" He closed his eyes, opened them, and answered. "Carson Prescott." The second code officer asked for counsel and said nothing else. The third, the one who had looked away earlier, offered half a sentence about administrative pressure, then stopped and never completed it. He kept that silence through dawn and through intake interview, and the recorder captured every second of it. Lena sat on a plastic chair while an EMS crew examined her neck under white task light. Bruising already darkened along the clavicle notch and lateral throat. Hoarseness, painful swallow, no airway compromise now. The medic photographed each mark with evidence scale tabs, then bagged the torn foreclosure packet Carson had shoved in her face. One page carried a faint smear of blood from the cut under her eye. Another had Carson's partial fingerprint in coffee oil near the forged county seal. Atlas remained standing until Jack crouched and touched 2 fingers behind his left ear. Then the old shepherd lowered, stiff and careful, and let Lena check his ribs. No fracture on palpation, likely heavy soft tissue bruise. She logged it aloud for the state line and the record. Retired MWD Atlas, impact to right lateral rib cage from a boot strike, observed at scene on video. Carson laughed once from the wall bench, brittle and high. You're documenting a dog before you document me? Mills looked at him without expression. You were documented from 6 angles. At 4:02 a.m., dispatch patched through county records. The emergency condemnation order number on Carson's packet belonged to a different address entirely, a condemned cold storage shed outside city limits. The notary commission on the transfer page had expired 19 months earlier. North Bend Renewal LLC appeared in the filing chain with a mailing address that matched a vacant suite leased by Prescott Development. Every layer started failing at once. At 4:21 a.m., State Investigator Dana Pierce arrived in a Navy windbreaker and nitrile gloves, read Lena her rights as victim witness, and took custody of the lockbox, drive, volunteer videos, body cam uploads, and the code officer's tablets. She asked one question before anything else. Any minors endangered? Lena pointed toward the secured hall where Mateo now sat wrapped in the Marine blanket on a chair, watched over by the volunteer who had steadied first. He saw the end, not the start. Dana nodded, wrote it down, and said, He gets a child advocate before any statement. At 5:06 a.m., Miles Prescott arrived in a black SUV with 2 attorneys and the confidence of a man entering a room he believed he owned. He got 3 steps into the corridor before seeing his son cuffed, state evidence bags on the intake desk, and Sergeant Mills refusing to clear the hallway. Miles's gaze landed on Jack in wet camouflage, then on Atlas, then on the foreclosure packet sealed in plastic. This is a misunderstanding, Miles said. Release my son. Dana Pierce answered, Your son is booked pending assault and document fraud review. You may speak through counsel. Miles tried a different target. Sergeant, this office receives substantial support from my foundation. Mills did not blink. Then your foundation can support due process. By sunrise, the county duty judge had accepted an emergency filing from state investigators to freeze transfer activity on the 11-acre parcel. Lena's archived intimidation footage, metadata reports, and forged easement comparisons entered the record before 7 a.m. The procurement officer Lena had called weeks earlier appeared on secure video and testified to altered submission chains. The legal aid clinic attorney who warned her about conflicts arrived in person with conflict waivers and a temporary protective order draft already printed. The state veterans liaison called back at 7:26 a.m. and authorized immediate institutional oversight review, noting probable interference with a veteran care operation. External contacts resolved. Every call had a voice attached now. By 10:14 a.m., Courtroom B at Ridgemont County was standing room only with clerks, press stringers, veterans in old unit caps, and people who had looked away for years and were looking straight ahead now. Carson sat in county gray beside counsel, wrists free but posture collapsed. Miles sat behind him with both hands clasped too tightly on a legal pad. Dana Pierce presented first. Assault footage, body cam timeline, forged filing sequence, and testimony from 2 code officers and 1 deputy. Then Lena, throat bruised and voice rough, identified the packet and confirmed prior intimidation events. Jack testified in 12 spare sentences, only what he observed, no embellishment. Atlas lay at his feet under counsel table, head up, eyes tracking every shift in Carson's hands. Then Dana introduced Exhibit 41, the deed chain nobody in the Prescott orbit had bothered to read fully. Ryan Keene's mother stood to authenticate it herself. Eleanor Keene was 72, small, steady, and carrying an envelope thick with notarized originals. "I funded this place in my son's name," she said. "And in the names of dogs who came home broken. Clause 9, C-Bar's commercial transfer outside veteran stewardship and triggers automatic state reversion review upon unlawful attempt." The judge adjusted his glasses, read the clause twice, and looked directly at Carson. "You attempted to seize protected memorial property using falsified instruments." Miles's attorney started to rise. "Your Honor." "Sit down," the judge said. "Preliminary injunction granted. Immediate referral for felony review on fraud and coercion counts. Sheriff contract conflicts to be audited. County code enforcement actions tied to this chain are suspended pending investigation." Now, the Prescott name had been carved on buildings all over town. In that courtroom, it became exhibit language, case captions, and sworn admissions. After court, the hospital board called an emergency noon session in the Prescott Pavilion, whose steel letters had intimidated half the county for a decade. By 1:03 p.m., under live local coverage and legal pressure, Miles Prescott stepped aside pending review. 2 board members resigned. A third requested independent forensic audit of donor-linked procurement. The sheriff's office announced internal affairs cooperation and reassigned every deputy tied to the overnight civil standby roster. Systemic collapse was not a speech. It was a chain reaction with paperwork, cameras, and people finally choosing record over fear. By late afternoon, cold sunlight slanted through the intake corridor windows at the facility, turning Atlas's coat to muted gold where it touched the light. The mop bucket was gone. The cinder block wall was cleaned but not repainted. Lena wanted the scuff marks photographed first. The foreclosure packet sat logged and sealed in the state custody. The lockbox and encrypted drive were signed into evidence. Volunteer phones were cloned and returned with receipt numbers. The unfinished sentence from the third code officer remained unfinished in transcript. Some silences stayed as they were. Mateo stood in the doorway in fresh clothes, blanket folded over one arm now, and watched Jack from across the room. Jack had finally sat on the intake bench, elbows on knees, shoulders heavy in a way Lena had seen only after bad calls. Adrenaline had burned off, leaving old grief exposed. His hands trembled once, barely visible, then stilled when Atlas rose. The shepherd crossed the concrete carefully, favoring the left rear for the first 3 steps, then steadying. He placed his head against Jack's chest and leaned in with full weight. Jack's chin dipped to rest against the dog's neck. His breathing slowed, count by count, until the edge left his posture. Lena heard Mateo whisper, small and clear, "Atlas." The dog lifted his head for the boy despite the rib pain, ears angling toward the voice, right ear a fraction behind left as always. Mateo came forward 1 step at a time, stopped where Lena had taught him to stop, and held out his hand low. Atlas touched his fingers, then pressed his muzzle into the child's palm. Eleanor Keene watched from the intake desk, eyes wet but steady. She crossed to Jack and placed the original deed envelope in his scarred hand. "Ryan wanted this to outlive us," she said. "You kept it alive long enough for the papers to catch up." Jack swallowed once. "He should have been here." "He was," Eleanor said, touching Atlas's shoulder. In both of you. Lena stood beside them, voice still rough, and looked down the corridor that had almost taken everything before dawn. Kennel Run C rattled once when a retired explosives dog shifted in sleep. Atlas's ear twitched at the sound, then settled. No panic spin. No blind surge. He stayed where he was, between Jack and Mateo, breathing steady in the fading light. The facility was still standing. The child was safe. The dog had chosen his circle and held it. Ridgemont finally had it on record.